before he left, sir?
Well, I wish him luck. He's got a big thing. We'll find out what's going on. They're militarily defeated.
At 0217 local time, the Strait of Hormuz looked calm only from a distance. Up close, it was a funnel of steel and nerves, with a U.S. aircraft carrier easing through one of the tightest maritime choke points on Earth, while 30 Iranian fast boats spilled out from the northern shoreline and nearby islands like shrapnel from a grenade. On the carrier's bridge, the geometry was instantly ugly. The lead contacts were already cutting across the shipping lane at high speed. More were pouring in behind them, weaving through civilian traffic, splitting into attack arcs, forcing every American watchstander to ask the same question at the same time. Was this harassment or the opening move of a kill box designed to trap a supercarrier in shallow water before anyone had room to breathe? The carrier was not alone. Yet a destroyer rode ahead on the threat axis, another guarded the rear quarter, and a cruiser watched the wider picture. Helicopters were on alert. Electronic warfare teams were already pulling emissions apart, trying to separate fishing chatter from military control nets. But ships that large do not dodge in a channel this narrow. In Hormuz, a carrier does not maneuver like a knife fighter, it moves like a city. And cities cannot sidestep swarms. That is why the moment mattered far beyond one transit. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil still touches this corridor in one form or another. The passage shrinks to a navigable throat only a few miles wide in each direction, hemmed by coastal missile batteries, hidden coves, useful islands, and a shoreline controlled by a force that has spent decades studying how to humble larger navies with speed, confusion, and concentrated risk. Iran's naval doctrine in these waters has never depended on matching the United States ship for ship. It depends on crowding the battle space, compressing decision time, and making a commander hesitate just long enough for a tactical nuisance to become a strategic shock. The boats themselves were small, but that was the point. Fast inshore attack craft, some little more than rigid hull inflatables with outboards, others heavier and armed with rockets, machine guns, and possible guided weapons, were hard to classify in real time. Their threat was not in armor or staying power. Their threat was in angle, speed, and number. 30 knots, 40 knots, some faster. They could dart from the clutter, force gunners to sort friend from foe through heat, shimmer, and spray, then close inside the range bands where a billion-dollar warship starts relying on seconds instead of miles. A handful of boats firing wildly is manageable. 30 approaching from multiple bearings in constricted water is an attempt to overload the human brain before it overloads the combat system. The most dangerous part was what could not be seen yet. Swarms in the Gulf are rarely just swarms. They can be decoys for coastal missile targeting, bait for a propaganda incident, screens for mine laying, or probes meant to trigger the first shot on camera. On American screens that night, several contacts broke away from the main group and sprinted toward positions that made little sense for a direct attack but perfect sense for observation and relay. Others slowed just enough to hold the carrier inside a moving ring. That changed the problem immediately. It looked organized. The strike group commander had almost no time to be wrong. Rules of engagement demanded identification of hostile intent, not guesswork, driven by adrenaline. Fire too early, and Washington wakes up to images of burning boats and a regional crisis handed to Tehran. Fire too late, and one explosive-laden craft punching into the side of an escort or even forcing a collision in the traffic lane could ignite exactly the crisis both sides claimed to want to avoid. Across secure circuits, warnings went out in English, then Farsi. The destroyer ahead shifted to a higher readiness posture, gunners trained on the closest arcs. The carrier increased speed as much as the channel allowed, which was not much. The boats kept coming. 7 minutes is a very short time in air combat, but in a maritime emergency, it can feel like an entire campaign. The regional air picture was already tense, and that mattered. 2 U.S. Air Force F-22 Raptors, already airborne on a regional combat air patrol, had been tied into the Gulf surveillance network from the start of the transit. The moment the surface plot around the carrier turned from noisy to ominous, the request moved fast, not a debate, not a theory, a demand for overhead dominance before the swarm crossed the line from intimidation into contact. The Raptors broke toward Hormuz hard, light, and clean. Air-to-air missiles in the bays, fuel planned around speed, not loiter. Their job was not to sink 30 boats with cinematic strafing runs. Their job was more important. Seize the air above the strait. Find any Iranian aircraft or drones trying to cue the swarm. Detect emitters that suggested coastal missile support. Force every hostile commander in the area to recalculate what happened next. From the instant they rolled into the push, the jets were building speed through darkness with that flat, violent acceleration only a fifth-generation fighter can make look effortless. On the water, the crisis kept tightening. The first wave of boats crossed inside 5 nautical miles. That is no longer theater. At those distances, a speedboat can cover ground alarmingly fast, especially if the defender is trying to avoid becoming the side that fires first. The destroyer's crew fired warning flares. A helicopter came up and held back, ready but cautious, because low and slow over a swarm is an invitation if weapons are already uncaged below. The cruiser tracked the whole mess, assigning priorities and feeding the carrier's combat direction center with a picture that changed you almost by the second. Then the Iranians split the formation again. A dozen craft surged toward the screening destroyer on the port bow, likely hoping to draw defensive fire away from the carrier. Another group cut across the merchant lane ahead of the strike group, threatening to force the entire formation to slow even more. The innermost cluster kept pressing the carrier itself, not in a neat line, but in loose, aggressive fragments, the kind of pattern that makes prediction harder and mistake more likely. One boat flashed a mounted launcher, another turned broadside long enough for sensors to catch heavy weapons on deck. More troubling, an airborne contact briefly appeared near the Iranian coast, low and intermittent, possibly a drone lifting to observe the encounter. That was when the first Raptor checked in. 7 minutes after the launch call, the lead F-22 arrived over the southern edge of the strait at high altitude and supersonic speed, its wingman seconds behind. No one on the boats could miss the message even before they saw the jets. The Raptors did not come hunting fiberglass hulls one by one. They came to collapse the enemy's confidence in the wider plan. Their sensors swept deep, fusing shipboard tracks, electronic emissions, and air contacts into one cleaner picture than the surface force alone could build under pressure. The suspected drone was identified first. It had climbed just enough to look down into the traffic separation scheme and feed targeting updates. One Raptor rolled toward it, held the intercept geometry for seconds that felt much longer to everyone listening, and destroyed it before it could retreat inland. The missile shot itself was almost anticlimactic compared with what it meant. In one move, the strike group was no longer blind to the possibility that the boats were operating with a real-time eye overhead. That single kill also told every Iranian controller watching a feed that the airspace they hoped to use as sanctuary had just closed. The second jet went to work on the invisible layer of the fight. Its pilot picked up emissions from the northern side of the strait that did not match commercial clutter. Nothing dramatic, just the sort of disciplined radar behavior that suggests somebody ashore is preparing options. The information went straight down the chain. Escorts adjusted orientation. Electronic warfare teams sharpened their jamming posture. A destroyer commander who had been staring at 30 fast-moving surface contacts now had confirmation that the swarm might be only the front edge of a more dangerous system. And that changed American behavior in the water immediately. Once the broader threat picture became clearer, hesitation started to narrow. The closest Iranian boats were no longer treated as annoying outriders. They were now part of a coordinated action with unknown escalation potential. That distinction matters. It is the difference between being patient and being late. The destroyer on the port bow fired a new sequence of warnings, this time backed by unmistakable action. Its forward gun traversed, stabilized, and sent controlled bursts into the water ahead of the lead boats. While white spray erupted in straight lines across black water, several craft broke hard away, others did not. One kept charging, bouncing so violently at speed it looked half airborne. Another swung toward the destroyer's beam where the ship's defensive angles were tighter. The American captain did not wait for a perfect frame. He ordered disabling fire. The next burst walked onto the lead boat and tore it apart. There was no huge explosion, just fragments, flame, and the abrupt physical fact that a vessel moving at high speed had ceased to exist as a vessel at all. Two more craft sheared off immediately. A third opened fire with tracers that stitched low over the water and answered the legal question nobody on the American net wanted to answer by interpretation alone. Hostile act confirmed. The strike group responded with practiced violence. The cruiser engaged the tracer source. The forward destroyer hammered another pair of boats, trying to cut inside the screen. A Seahawk, now cleared into the fight, came in from offset angle and used its own weapons and spotlight discipline to scatter a cluster attempting to regroup off the carrier's starboard quarter. Through all of it, the carrier kept moving because the carrier's survival in a choke point depends less on dramatic turns than on refusing to become fixed. Above them, the Raptors kept pressing the invisible boundary that made the surface engagement survivable. One remained high to dominate the air picture. The other dropped lower, not to strafe, but to make presence undeniable over the northern approaches. Every small craft commander below now knew two things. American ships had crossed from warning to destruction, and the sky was no longer permissive. In swarm tactics, confidence is fuel. Once it burns off, formations decay fast. That decay started within minutes. Boats on the outer ring turned first, accelerating back toward Iranian waters. Inner elements tried to disengage in fragments, which only made them easier to track. A few kept up token aggression, more out of confusion than design. They were dealt with quickly. The destroyers did not chase blindly north. They held formation discipline, protected the carrier, and refused the temptation to trade a local tactical success for a wider trap. The message was precise. The transit would continue, the screen would hold, and any unit that re-entered lethal range with hostile intent would be destroyed. By the time the carrier passed the worst compression point in the strait, the battle had already shifted from contact to consequence. Several Iranian boats were burning or dead in the water. Others had fled. The drone feed was gone. Shore-based controllers, if they had intended to push the episode further, now faced a harder reality. To continue would mean escalating under American air dominance and against a strike group that had proven it would shoot once the threshold was crossed. The immediate crisis ended not with a grand duel, but with the swarm unraveling under layered pressure. That is how credible military responses usually work. Not magic, not theatrics, systems defeating systems, surface guns creating space, helicopters disrupting angles, electronic warfare muddying coordination, a pair of F-22s turning the wider battle space from ambiguous to hostile for anyone trying to support the attack. The 7-minute response did not win the fight alone, but it prevented the fight from becoming the kind of regional ambush Iran's doctrine is built to exploit, and the strategic meaning ran deeper than damaged boats. Tehran's maritime strategy, depends on proving that large American platforms can be psychologically paralyzed in confined water, not necessarily sunk, just boxed in, exposed, and forced into bad choices under cameras and coastal missiles. That night, the opposite message went out. A carrier strike group in Hormuz could still be pressured, still be tested, still be crowded, but it could also integrate sea control, air superiority, and rules-based fire discipline fast enough to break a swarm before the swarm became a headline victory. For Washington, that mattered because deterrence in the Gulf is not built on speeches. It is built on whether local commanders believe they can act faster than a crisis can metastasize. For Iran, the lesson was just as stark. Speedboats are dangerous when they multiply uncertainty. They are much less dangerous when the defender sees the whole board, kills the eyes above the fight, and refuses to panic in a confined channel. By sunrise, tankers were still moving, insurance markets were rattled, regional capitals were on the phone, intelligence shops on both sides were already dissecting every radar return, radio call, and weapons release. But one fact stood above the noise. 30 fast boats had surged at an American aircraft carrier in the most sensitive waterway on the planet, and the gamble failed because the United States answered the swarm the way modern naval power is supposed to answer it, not with one heroic shot, but with a chain of calm, lethal decisions made before the trap could close. In the Strait of Hormuz, 7 minutes was all the margin anyone got, and it was enough to remind the region that a carrier under pressure is still a carrier, but a carrier with Raptors overhead is something far harder to corner.